Is it a sin? That's a weighted question that's been asked about so many different topics for hundreds, thousands of years inside the church. And today we're going to wrestle with that through Romans chapter 14. When we look at our life, when we look at some of the things the Bible doesn't directly address, how do we answer that question? Let's check it out.
Well, good morning. Hey, today is March 20th, 2022, in case you needed a little date check there. But something happened on March 20th, 2016. Anyone know what that was? This church started. Yes. 6 years ago today, we actually launched as Palm Vista Baptist Phoenix. And then you're like, we're Southern Baptist, what? And then we changed our name a little bit to Cross Church, same church. But 6 years ago, we started this journey. Okay? You've heard me, if you've been here, you've heard me say this a million times. This is a big deal. And one of the big deals, because when we started here 6 years ago, we were the sixth church, in 5 years that had come on this campus. It's seen constant turnover. And man, when we started, I will say, we had no idea what we were doing, right? We launched the plane and we're building it in midair. We were trying to figure out what was going on. And that's not really advisable, right? It makes a little bumpiness along the way. But I just want to say, God has been faithful. And there's been some valleys and there's been some rough patches. When we started this church, the only ones who are still part of it is me and my wife. And actually, we see a picture right there. And then Scott and Donna, who, if you know, lead one of our Bible groups. Donna does our kids ministry. They're amazing servants here. But it was just the four of us, right? Like my three kids, they waited to see if the church would last before they came into the world, right? They're all under 6, you get it. But we started this, but then God has been great as we've grown through it. And here's what I've learned it can be hard. And sometimes in church life, but in our personal lives, we overestimate what we can do in a couple years. And we overestimate maybe what God can do in a couple of years, but we underestimate what God can do in 5, 10 years. And you see, God has been doing some amazing things. In those first 2 years, they were rough, but God has done amazing things in the last 4. And I cannot wait for our 10-year anniversary to look back. It's going to happen, right? I was going to be there. But to look back and see all that God has done. And here's what I want to encourage you, is to keep plugging away. If you're sitting here and you're kind of on the sidelines and you've been an observer, stop observing and get your hands in the dirt. Be a part of the family. Be a part of what is happening here. Serve with us. Do life together and see how God changes. And maybe you've just been checking it out and you're like, you guys are energetic, maybe a little weird, but I want to see what this is about. Your invitation is right after service, right? Come to Pizza with the Pastor and come see us. And we want to talk about what that on-ramp looks like because, man, we are excited about what God is going to continue to do in the years to come. So give one more round of applause for God and his faithfulness. Alcohol, movies, TV shows, music, legal drugs, oh, that's a scary one, dancing, wealth, you're like, where am I going with this? Tobacco, technology, social media, food, the list can go on and on and on. You see, for thousands of years in the church, there have been a lot of discussions, a lot of division, and a lot of kind of angst over things in our world that the Bible necessarily doesn't talk about or doesn't talk about in the detail we want it. I don't know about you, but 2,000 years ago when Jesus was having his ministry on earth, I wish he would have just spoke out and been like, TikTok is an app that's going to come later, and I'm just condemning it as something stupid now. So, and maybe because I'm not cool enough to be on TikTok, if he just spoke some things like, hey, here's a list of everything that is going to come, that is going to be a question of I don't know about that, and here's it's just wrong. But you see, the Bible actually doesn't give us that list on everything. And there's so many things in our world that Christians have been debating about for years or arguing over, that at the bottom line, it kind of gets to this core question of, is it a sin? Today, we're going to dig into Romans chapter 14, and we're going to actually ask that question, because I think this passage kind of gets to the heart of it, is what is a sin in our life? And I say some of those, and some of those are serious things. You're like, and in your mind, you're like, oh yeah, that's a sin. And then other ones are like, what? Like, why would you put that in there? Like dancing? If you don't know that that's a sin, then you didn't grow up in some different churches, right? There's an old joke in very traditional Baptist churches, we're the cooler Southern Baptists, but they said, watch out because sex can lead to dancing, okay? See. Yep. Okay. You're like, what in the world? But anyway, today as we dig into this, we're going to ask this question, is it a sin in our lives? And I think as we kind of get here, and one of the themes that Paul's going to talk about is it starts with our faith. So let me give you a key thought today that we're going to kind of dissect in this passage and we're going to flesh out a little bit more, is this, that a healthy faith has a balance of freedom and accountability. As I was studying this passage this week, there were so many themes that kept popping up, but faith was one of those ones that was just so overlaid in this passage. And the writer of Romans, Paul, actually talks extensively about the topic of faith throughout his letters. One of them was in Ephesians chapter 3, and in verse 12, he says this, "In him and through faith in him, we may approach God with freedom and confidence." You see, one of the things Paul talks about is that because of the freedom our faith gives us and faith in God, that we can approach God. Now, that's a big deal, because if you read the Old Testament, and I've actually been reading through the Old Testament right now in my kind of Bible reading plan on my own, and I just got through the Judges into Ruth, but there's so many in that Old Testament, is they couldn't just call up God, or they couldn't just pray to God and say hey, what's up? You went through an intermediary. You went through Moses, or you talked to a prophet, or talked to one of the judges to seek God's will. But our faith through Jesus Christ allows us to have access to God. But you see, not only do we have this freedom that we can approach him, but that's not a haphazard freedom. That's not a loose freedom, but there's also accountability in it. Ephesians chapter 3, verse 17, as he goes on in that passage, he says, "Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power, together with all the Lord's holy people," listen to this, is a key word here, "to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ." You see, not only does our faith give us the freedom to approach God, but it also gives us the accountability to understand, to grasp the depth of God, the depth of his love, the depths of who he is. And by doing this, and you're like, where am I going with this? This allows us to answer the question in our lives of, is it sin? So let's start and look at the first half of this faith today. We're going to be in Romans chapter 15. And the first question we're going to ask is, what does freedom in our faith look like? A couple weeks ago, I can't even remember why, but my wife, she was gone, and I think she had all the kids. So I was literally home alone with no wife and no 3 kids. You know what I had? Freedom, right? No, I'm just kidding. I had no obligations, though. I could just do whatever. I wasn't responsible for keeping another human alive because my wife wasn't there. Just kidding. You get that. But I could do whatever. So and here's kind of my routine. When I have some quiet time, or the kids are asleep, or if my wife's gone, or whatever that is, I've kind of had this set up. I have a Nintendo Switch. So I will watch a show. I'll start Netflix. I'll have my AirPod hooked up to the Apple TV so I can hear it clearly. I'll have one ear out in case, someone's dying. But I'll watch a show, and then I'm playing my Switch here. So I'm multitasking. My wife has come in for what are you doing? I'm I'm maximizing my entertainment value right now, right? I'm soaking it all up as much as I can. Simultaneously, while checking NBA standings to see if Golden State lost and the Suns have clinched. But anyway. But is that the freedom and faith I'm talking about? That there's no obligations, that you can just spend your time however you want? Well, not exactly. That's not exactly how our faith works, but it does mean a few different things. A freedom in our faith look like. And the first thing it means is that we grow at our own speed. Look at Romans chapter 14, starting in verse 1. It says this, that except anyone who is weak in faith. But don't argue about disputed matters. One person believes he may eat anything, while one who is weak eats only vegetables. Say, what? Like, okay, Paul's throwing some punches. Verse 3. One who eats must not look down on one who does not eat, and one who does not eat must not judge one who does, because God has accepted him. Who are you to judge another's household servant? Before his own Lord he stands or falls, and he will stand because the Lord is able to make him stand. Paul starts this chapter, and he makes some pretty heavy comments here. First, he calls out some people who are weak in their faith. And now, when you first read this, you're like, is Paul just kind of being like rude here? Is he being a little bit of a jerk? Like, did he just call all like vegetarians weak, right? Like, if you're a vegetarian, you're weak. I used to actually think that, right? You know, you think like meat makes you strong, vegetarians are weak. And then there's two people that changed my opinion on that. One was Chris Paul of the Phoenix Suns, who's on a completely vegan diet and is a professional athlete and in the best shape of his life at 36 years old. And he runs circles around other people, and he should be too old for that, but he's a vegan. He can make it work somehow. And I also knew another vegan guy who used to run laps. He used to come to our church, and he'd run laps all over our city, and he was a boxer. So I never made any vegan comments to him because he would beat me up, right? He had a six-pack and was ripped. Well, Paul isn't here just saying like, no, just because you're a vegetarian or vegan, that means you're weak. He's actually not talking about nutritional diet here, but he's talking about more of a spiritual and kind of ceremonial law behind this. You see, they had in the Old Testament, there was certain foods they were forbidden to eat. And they were taking the old ceremonial law of the Old Testament and applying it to their New Testament church. And Paul is saying, no, that's not what God told you to do. But Paul was saying that these people who are trying to apply these old ways, these old traditions, and shoe them horn in and make it form their way of how they saw Jesus in the church, that they were immature or weak in their faith. But he wasn't doing this in a rude way. Instead, he was doing it in a way that said, treat them like a child learning. You see, the trap all of us can fall into is judging other people and judging where other people are at. And if we aren't careful, we can even do that in church. Do you know sometimes people judge in church, right? Shocker, I know. But here's the deal. We all grow at our own speed. And maybe you even see someone who's been in church for years and they're like, oh, you should know that maybe that's not right. But God has gifted us all individually. And I want to say thank God that we don't get written tests in church, right? That we don't like pass out tests and we grade them after and it's like, you get an A, you get an F, like, you know, go study and go try harder again. Instead, like church isn't designed like that. Except when you're in like Sunday school or like, you know, Bible study or kids church, the answer was always Jesus, no matter what they said. Like you're talking about Isaiah and the kid's like, Jesus. And you're like, no, well, actually that is right because he's pointing to Jesus in the New Testament. So he's okay. But instead, how church is set up, how this faith is set up is that it's almost like God is our personal tutor. And we move at our own speed. We don't move at the speed of the classroom. We move at the speed of how God allows us. And sometimes it takes us getting hit in the head over and over and over again by the same spiritual truth before we let it actually get down deep into our hearts. And God is saying here and through Paul that there is kind of this liberating, freeing feeling knowing we don't have to figure everything out before a test is given, but that we can focus on the major things and God will slowly grow us in the minors. But not only do we grow at our own speed, we also worship in our own style. Keep going in verse 5. He says, one person judges one day to be more important than another day. Someone else judges every day to be the same. Let each one be fully convinced in his own mind. Whoever observes the day observes it for the honor of the Lord. Whoever eats, eats for the Lord, since he has given thanks, and whoever does not eat, it is for the Lord that he does not eat it, and he gives thanks to God. Two key words in these verses here are honor and thanks. And these are actually two things that our worship does. When we sing worship to God, we honor God because he is all-powerful, because he is full of glory. We are honoring him by either singing songs or reading. We're going to talk a little bit more about it. It's not just that, but we're also giving thanks. We're saying thanksgiving for all that God has done in our lives and in our world. And you see, Paul is addressing these arguments actually about the Sabbath day. Is that kind of the Jews who had grown up and then converted over and see Jesus as the Messiah, they said, hey, this is the Sabbath, you keep it as holy no matter what. And then the newer Gentile Christians were like, well, but every day is great. Every day is an opportunity to honor God. Every day is to do this. And Paul, instead of letting them get in a fight about it, he's like, no, time out. Observe it how you want. Worship God in your own way, but still keep the spirit of the Sabbath rather than the legal law. The spirit of the Sabbath was to rest and reflect on the glory of God. And Paul here is saying that for us today, we will worship in different ways. You look around the room during our singing worship time and you see that, right? Like some put their hands up, some put their hands down. Some cross their arms and look angry. I would encourage you to open up a little bit more. But maybe you're worshiping in your own way. Like some sit, some bob. I can't, I'm not one that can stand still. Like I didn't have ADHD as a kid, I don't think, but maybe I do as an adult. So I bob and move a lot. But whatever it is your way of worshiping here, that also continues out into our week. You see, you're going to worship different than other people around you. Because God has wired you a little bit different than everyone else around you. And here Paul is saying, don't get caught up on the legalism of it. Don't get caught up in it has to be done exactly this way. But focus on the fact, are you honoring and giving thanks to God? Lastly, we see there is freedom in our faith that we set our own guardrails. Jump down to verse 14. And we're going to jump around to 2 verses here because he kind of goes around the passage. But verse 14, he says, I know and I am persuaded in the Lord Jesus that nothing is unclean in itself. Still, to someone who considers a thing to be unclean, to that one it is unclean. Skip down to verse 22. He says, whatever you believe about these things, keep between yourself and God. Blessed is the one who does not condemn himself by what he approves. You see, Paul lands on these issues that were threatening to bring division to the church. Rome had these churches, and we don't know if this was to one church or many churches in Rome, but it was to at least these body of believers. But they were about to take their church of Rome and create First Church of Rome of the vegetarians, First Church of Rome of the carnivores, First Church of Rome of the wine drinkers, First Church of Rome of the grape juice during communion drinkers, right? The First Baptist Church. Just kidding. But these issues were boiling up so much that they were about to divide the church. And Paul says, time out. He finally stated here, you put your own guardrails in place between you and God. Meaning you decide what is hindering your relationship with God, what is defined as sin that causes you to stumble. So here's what that means. If you can eat meat and faithfully follow God, do it. If you can drink alcohol and faithfully follow God, do it. If you can watch a movie and faithfully follow God, do it. If you can fill in the blank, whatever it is that you have, that there is this debate about in our churches and among Christianity, and you can faithfully follow God and do that thing, then it's okay to do. But, here's a big but, if those cause you to sin, or if those are considered unclean in your mind and you do them, then you are sinning. And this is the deep part that Paul gets into here, is this is where it gets careful, and it's going to get even harder when we get to the second half of things, is because we need to be careful of what we say is right or wrong. And this is so difficult because there is freedom that looks very gray and causes us to take responsibility for our actions instead of someone telling us firmly what is right or wrong. You see, this is kind of a little bit of a break from some of how church happened, especially in the Western world in kind of the 1900s. And maybe you experienced some of this in the 80s, the 90s, that there was a very kind of legalistic tone to a lot of churches, saying, don't do this, right? Don't dance, don't touch alcohol, don't whatever it is, fill in the blank. And I'm not going to go through each issue and say whether it's right or wrong, because again, Paul doesn't. He says, it's up to that person's conscience. And what's so hard is we can have this kind of running list of okay, this is right, this is wrong. And sometimes we want that list. I don't know if you're a parent listening, you're like, yeah, can you give that to me so I can tell my kids, this is where you're a jerk and this is where you're not a jerk, right? Don't do this, do this. I want to put them in a bubble and protect them. But here, Paul kind of tells us there is freedom in our faith in a scary way that we kind of decide what is crossing the boundaries. Now, I want to get a little kind of side note here. Now, Paul is talking about these with things that are what I would say non-essentials and things that aren't set stone moral law. You see, we do have what we call the 10 Commandments. And you go through that 10 list, and every single one is a sin, as it was in the Old Testament, as in the New Testament, right? Murdering someone, yeah, it's a sin, right? Hating someone, yeah, that's a sin. Sleeping with someone that's not your spouse, that's a sin, right? And you can stealing, go through the list. Those are it. But in these gray issues is where it gets a little bit more difficult. But as we said at the beginning, there is a balance here. Not only is there this freedom side, but then there's a scarier side, which is the accountability one, which begs us to ask the question of what does accountability in our faith look like? I was reflecting on this this last week, and I can't remember when it happened. I think it happened far too late. As you know, I'm in my 30s now, and I remember this realization one time, and I think it was like my mid to late 20s, that like I can make my own decisions, and I'm like the boss of my schedule, right? In some ways. And you laugh because you're like, no, your wife is. No, but honestly, I can make my own decisions, okay? As a grown-up, I don't have a parent anymore saying don't do this, you can't do this. Like if I want to, I can stay up till 12 o'clock midnight and watch Netflix every single night. Is it stupid because I'll have kids screaming at 3 a.m. and then have to wake up at 5 or 6? Yeah, but I can make the decision to do that. And there comes a point in all of our lives where we realize that we are the masters of the decisions we're going to make. But that doesn't mean just because we have the freedom to make those decisions that there's not ultimately consequences behind them. And that we don't have a bigger accountability to other people in our life. So how do we practice this accountability? Well, the first way is we answer to God above all else. Check out Romans chapter 14, looking at verse 7. And he starts this way. He says, for none of us lives for himself. We'll preach a sermon on that. I promise I won't. But that's a heavy statement. None of us lives for himself, and no one dies for himself. If we live for the Lord. And if we die for the Lord. Therefore, we live or die, we belong to the Lord. Verse 9, Christ died and returned to life for this, that he might be Lord over both the dead and the living. But you, why do you judge your brother or sister? Or you, why do you despise your brother and sister? For listen to this, we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. That's a terrifying verse. Verse 11, for it is written, as I live, says the Lord, every knee will bow to me, and every tongue will give praise to God. So then, each of us will give an account of himself to God. Listen to that. Each of us will give an account of himself to God. Here's where this freedom gets uncomfortable, is we may not have to answer to other people, and maybe we don't answer to them, maybe we pay the consequences later, whatever that looks like, but we do ultimately have to answer to God. And Paul really gets here to what I call his grown-up theology. This is adult theology right here, right? Because he's saying, I'm not going to treat you like kids. He said, you have to be in charge of your own sin. You have to be in charge of your own conscience, because I'm not going to answer every single issue for you, but I'm ultimately going to answer for myself and for my own sin, not other people's. My son, he is about to turn 4 years old. And it seems like every time he gets in a fight with his 5-year-old sister and he's in trouble, and I say, Archer, why did you do that? I'm like, Archie, no. The first words out of his mouth are, but Arya. But Arya, his sister is Arya. But Arya. He didn't I'm saying, Archer, why'd you hit her? And he doesn't say because I was rude and I lost my temper and I'm sorry, I sinned. But Arya. And when we stand before God, we can't say, but my spouse, but that person down the road, but my parents, right? I can blame my parents. They gave me a bad childhood, whatever. But this other person, instead, God's going to have you answer for yourself. And when we stand before God, man, we give an account of ourselves to God. And you see, we answer to him above all else. But if that wasn't hard enough, you're like, okay, maybe I can deal with that. All right. I understand I'm responsible for my own decisions. I'm responsible for my own action. But then he adds another layer on top of this. He also says we are responsible for one another. Let's keep reading in verse 13. He says, therefore, let us no longer judge one another. Instead, decide never to put a stumbling block or a pitfall in the way of your brother or sister. I know, and I am persuaded in the Lord, that nothing is unclean in itself. Still, to someone who considers a thing to be unclean, to that one it is unclean. For if your brother or sister is hurt by what you eat, you are no longer walking according to love. Do not destroy by what you eat someone for whom Christ died. Therefore, do not let your good be slandered. Verse 17, for the kingdom of God is not eating and drinking, but righteousness, peace, and joy in the Holy Spirit. Whoever serves Christ in this way is acceptable to God and receives human approval. You see, we not only need to answer to God for our own sin, but we also have a responsibility not to cause another brother or sister to stumble. And this is where it gets difficult. This is where it gets even messier. Because of our freedom of conscience, right? I have a freedom of conscience saying this thing isn't a sin. If it is hurting someone else and causing them to sin, it is now a sin. Let me give you an illustration. Say you have a friend who is on a diet and they've been faithful. Right? They love cookies. And if you like cookie places, or the new rage, right? You can go down the street, like forget Crumble, they're corporate, right? Go to Soda Mix Cookies on 7th Street and Bell. And I might be causing some of you to stumble, so I'm going to stop talking. But say you're on a diet and you've been doing good, and then all of a sudden you invite that friend over and you have a giant dessert spread. You have all their favorite desserts and you lay them out. And then you say, eat and be merry, right? Kind of like I've been watching a lot of Viking show lately. And like, go, this is all yours, flourish in it. And it causes them to stumble. That is the sin that we are doing in our lives. The same can be, and you apply this to plug in whatever topic is into there. You're talking about alcohol. Maybe it's not a sin for you to drink alcohol, but you have a friend who's an alcoholic, and as soon as they see it or have one sip, they're going to go down a downward spiral that's going to lose control and is going to cause them to sin. And if you invite them to the bar, I think you're missing the mark a little bit there. Or you invite them to your house and offer them a drink, you're missing the mark. Or you invite them to your house and you have alcohol out, you are missing the mark. And this is where we are responsible for those around us. We have an obligation, a responsibility born of love to care for those around us, our brothers and sisters, not to put a stumbling block in front of them so that they can fall to sin as well. Lastly, and this is going to be our last part of what does this accountability in our faith look like, is we aspire for peace over preference. Check out verse 19. He says, so then, let us pursue what promotes peace and what builds up one another. Do not tear down God's work because of food. Everything is clean. But it is wrong to make someone fall by what he eats. It is a good thing not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything that makes your brother or sister stumble. Here's what Paul is ultimately saying, is he's saying, stop the stupid fights. Stop fighting over what does not matter. He says, do what is best for the church as a whole, rather than fighting over these things that in eternity, God's not going to check our scorecard for. And here, as just the church in Rome, he's saying, I don't want you to be known as those who eat meat and who don't eat meat, those who drink and those who don't drink. He's like, cut all that out. Just be the church that's on mission for Jesus Christ. And sometimes that's going to make you check your personal preferences at the door so that you can have peace with your brothers and sisters and ultimately move forward in lockstep on telling more people about who Jesus is. And you see, it can be so easy to take our eye off the ball, to get focused on the little things that don't matter, because it's literally our human nature. I was thinking about this last week. If you go to work and you have the mindset of, I'm going to accomplish this today, I'm going to accomplish this week, and I'm going to accomplish this month and year, you're going to be super productive, right? And maybe some of you guys do that in your work or whatever that is, but when we get distracted is when we start checking our social media, we start texting people, we start watching a funny video, or we start roaming the office to go talk to people, right? You know, like Jerry will talk your ear off, so you're like, I don't feel like working today, I'm just going to go talk to him. Sometimes that's your boss, and you can get away with it, right? But whatever that is, we can get distracted. But what would happen if we were 100% committed to making Jesus known deeper in our lives, in the lives of those in our church, and in the lives of us that aren't here yet? You see, that's what Paul is calling us to do, is to be united church that is focused on what God's ultimate mission is of telling people about Jesus. And we're going to wrap this up with the very final 2 verses of this passage. In verse 22, here's what he dives into. He says this, that whatever you believe about these things, keep between yourself and God. Blessed is the one who does not condemn himself by what he approves. Verse 23, but whoever doubts stands condemned if he eats, because his eating is not from faith, and everything that is not from faith is sin. Here's the bottom line I'm going to give us, and kind of wrapping up this passage today. And I know this has been a lot. It's like drinking from a fire hose, right? I have another 40 minutes in me, but I don't think you guys do. So, but here's the bottom line for us today, is that God treats us like adults who are free to enjoy the gifts of this world with the accountability that comes from our faith in God. You see, there are things in our world that is a gift. I personally think meat is a gift from God, and cheese. That's why I can't be vegan, right? I've thought about it, but I couldn't eat Mexican food of all the Mexican food I eat, so I don't know how I do it. I'm like, I'll just go run instead. I can't be a vegan. But there are gifts in our world that God gives us, but those gifts, when we're used the wrong way, can cause us to sin and cause us to stumble. But God gives us freedom in how we can enjoy that, as long as we're not pushing ourselves to sin or pushing those around us to sin. And you see, when we live in this balance of our faith, of the freedom we have to approach him, the freedom of we have to live with him, but also the accountability to ultimately tell people about Jesus and do what's best for expanding his kingdom, that's when we see the beauty of God's church. And this morning, I want to challenge you to exactly do that. Is what would it look like if we were a united church focused on the mission of making Jesus known in our community and beyond? And we drop the stupid issues that maybe matter today, but ultimately don't matter in deciding ours or someone else's eternity. Let's pray this morning.